Hi guys! Welcome to section 3 of your course, and we're moving on to a totally different topic, which is differentiation. So we've covered the lesson plan structure, and now we're going to see how we can differentiate within our lesson plan. So most teachers are already aware of this term in traditional classes, but it's a bit hard to adapt when it moves on to the remote classroom or the online classroom. So whether or not you do know, if you are a bit rusty and you need to remember what differentiation is, we're going to quickly brush on what it is and give examples. Just as a brief introduction for this lecture, if you are unaware what it means or this is the first time for you to hear it, don't worry and don't get nervous, please. It's not as difficult and challenging as it might seem. This is exactly why, or this is exactly what this lecture is for. Okay, so without further ado, our lecture today has two sections. Okay, the first section is an introduction to just tell you what differentiation is, okay, what it means and why it's important in the classroom. And then the second part is going to give you examples of ways within which you can differentiate in the class. So the whole concept of differentiation, it's actually from the word different. Every student is different. Every learner is different. So a one-size-fits-all approach does not work here. This is the total opposite of differentiation. You cannot use the same technique, the same content, the same style with all your students. This is what differentiation stands for. That every student is different and they learn in different ways and in different paces. And it's your job as a teacher, challenging as it might seem a little bit, to accommodate to your learners' needs and to teach them in the best way possible for them as individuals, not as a class. So what is differentiation? In simple terms, differentiation means tailoring instruction to meet individual needs. So you know your students' needs and then you tailor or you accommodate your content accordingly based on those needs. Okay? So every student has different interests. Every student has different linguistic abilities. Every student has a different way of learning. Your job when you differentiate in the class is to accommodate your instruction to that so that it fits every student. Now, teachers can differentiate by a number of ways. The most common are the 6 methods, which is content. So content means the content that you provide them with. You don't give them the same content. You could give simplified, let's say, for the low achieving students or the struggling students, and then a bit more advanced content for your high achievers. Or maybe you can provide the lesson in a lecture or a podcast for your auditory students and as a video for your visual students. This is just an example. So the actual content you provide, the process within which you teach them. If you have a visual student, then you might use the board in class so that they can see what you're saying. If you have an auditory student, you have to make sure to have a discussion with them so that they understand more, and so on. Product is what you want your student to give you by the end of the session. So maybe if I have, based on my students' interests, I can have one student submit in the activity, let's say a news article and design it, and maybe somebody else could create a video. Somebody else could create a presentation. Somebody else could create a podcast, and so on. Learning environment, how do they learn best? Do they learn best one-on-one? Do they learn best in an isolated room? Do they learn best within the support of specific peers? And so on. The assessment is basically the kinds of activities you provide or the types of questions that you provide for your students. You might not have the same assessment or the same quiz or the same worksheet for everyone. And finally, grouping. Do they work better on their own? Do they work better in pairs? Do they work better? Does this specific student work better with that specific student because they mentor them along the way, because they are very high achievers, because they have a good relationship with them and they don't feel shy asking about all the questions that they have? Do they work better in groups? Should I create heterogeneous groups? Should I create homogeneous groups? Should I put all the high achievers in a group and give them a challenging task? Or should I mix up the groups and then give them a moderate task so that high achievers could pull up low achievers and so on? Those are so many questions you could ask yourself when you're differentiating. So those are the 6 aspects in which you can differentiate. Okay, how do you differentiate in those aspects? According to what? So if you're differentiating your content, you provide 2 or 3 versions based on what? What's the first version for, or who's the first version for? The second version is for who, and the third version is for who. This is what we're going to cover next in the next part. So there are lots of methods, but I like to focus on those 3 because they're the most common and you can easily adapt them online. So the first way is by learning styles. And I think we briefly mentioned this before, such as visual, auditory, kinesthetic learners, tactile learners, and so on. And we're going to go deeper into that next lecture. So maybe provide a visual aid for visual students and also accompany that with a recording of yourself explaining it or a discussion for auditory and so on. The second part is intelligence type. Now, I usually tell my students at the beginning of the year, there's no such thing as a stupid person. We're all clever, we are all smart in our own ways. So even if you're not smart linguistically, you're smart in numbers. If you're not smart in numbers, you could be smart in reading maps. And if you're not smart with reading maps, you're smart when conducting a presentation, explaining to the class, and so on. So knowing your student's intelligence type enables you to provide more activities based on that. Now, there are 7 intelligence types that we need to cater for. And I'm going to cover that briefly maybe next session. I don't want to overwhelm you now with all the 7 types. But next session, I'm going to give you examples. And what you can do is for both learning styles and intelligence types to give your students surveys at the beginning of the year, explain to them the concepts of learning styles and intelligence types, let them take a survey so they know their intelligence type and their learning style. And you as a teacher know how many styles you have in class, so you can cater to them. The third most obvious way is achievement. Achievement here means your students' learning level. So not all your students are on grade level. You will find this a lot. Not all your students are on grade level. You have some high achievers and you have some low achievers. And not all your class is high achievers and not all your class is low achievers. So the basic way for differentiating by achievements is to have 3 classifications in your class. So for every task that you have, maybe you could provide a very, very challenging task for the high achievers, a moderate task for your middle achievers, which is something on level, and a simplified task for your low achievers. This is the basic way. Okay, how do you know who your low, middle, high achievers are? Well, you have a number of options. First thing you can think of is if you're teaching middle school, you can take their MAP scores. If you're teaching high school, you can use maybe if they started taking IELTS or TOEFL tests, you can use that. If not, what you can do is to just go back to their exam scores, even your own quizzes, the periodic quizzes that you give them, the exit slips, and so on. Just make sure to go back to data because this is what makes it more accurate, let's say. So when you check your test results, you can, let's say, group all the people who got 7 and above in a group. Those are your high achievers. And then let's say between 6 to 8, this is your middle achievers. And then from 1 to 5, those are your low. For example, this is just a quick example for you. You can choose your own method. So check previous exams of the previous year, previous quarter, your last exam, your last quiz. Of course, the more basic way to differentiate by achievement is based on your knowledge of your students. You know who your high achievers are, who your low achievers are, who your middle achievers are. However, to be very honest with you, this is not entirely accurate and not entirely fair, especially when you're doing online classes. Maybe you have a better grasp of this in your traditional classroom because you get to see your students one by one. You get to hear each one of them talk and participate. However, this is a bit harder to control online. So your best resort is to go back to data as I explained earlier. And that's it. We are done with today's lecture. We're going to move on into more detail next lecture about the different learning styles and the intelligence types and so on. But for now, I just want you to please pause, reflect, ask yourself, why is differentiation important based on what we covered? and what are the different ways you can differentiate in your class. Thank you so much for watching, guys. See you next lecture.